I almost missed it. My son squeezed my hand twice under the table, and for a second I thought it was an accident. He hadn't done that since he was 9 years old. We were sitting at the dining room table in the house I've lived in for 22 years. It was a Sunday in late October, that particular kind of Sunday in Ontario where the sky goes flat and gray by 2 in the afternoon and you start thinking about whether you turn the furnace on. My son had driven up from Toronto with his girlfriend. Her name was Ingrid. They'd been together about 8 months. This was the third time I'd met her. My wife passed 4 years ago. Breast cancer, caught late. After that, it was just me and the house and the dog and whatever version of routine I could build around the absence of her. My son checked in every few weeks, called on Sundays, sometimes drove up on long weekends. He was 31, a project manager at a construction firm downtown. Steady, careful, not the kind of person who makes decisions quickly or says things he doesn't mean. He got that from his mother. Ingrid was different from the women he'd brought home before. She was confident in a way that filled rooms. Not loud, but present. She had an answer for everything, always delivered with a small smile, like she'd already considered your follow-up question. She complimented the house when she came in, but specifically, not what a lovely home the way people do when they're being polite. She said she liked the built-in shelving in the hallway, said it looked original, asked if I'd done it myself. I had. Carol had picked out the stain color. I said yes years ago, and she nodded like that confirmed something. Dinner was a pot roast. I'd had it in the slow cooker since noon. My son had called ahead and asked what he could bring, and I'd said nothing, same as always, and he'd shown up with a bottle of red wine and a bag of dinner rolls from the bakery on Elgin Street that I'd mentioned once, maybe 6 months ago, that I liked. That's the kind of person he is. We sat down around 6. The dog settled under my chair. The wine was open. The first hour was easy. We talked about his work, a hospital addition project running behind schedule because of a subcontractor issue. Ingrid asked questions that sounded knowledgeable, permit timelines, labor disputes. She mentioned she had a cousin in the trades. My son looked at her when she said things, the way people look at someone they're still a little amazed by. She was good. I'll say that plainly. She was very good. Around the time I brought out the roast, the conversation shifted. Ingrid asked about the neighborhood, whether property values had held up, whether I'd had any trouble with the new development going in 2 streets over. I said the construction noise had been a nuisance in the summer, but it didn't bother me much. She nodded and said property in small city Ontario had been remarkably resilient, that she'd been watching the numbers closely. I asked what she meant by watching the numbers. She said she'd been working with a small investment group for the past 2 years. Private equity, mostly residential and mixed-use properties in secondary markets, places like this one. She said the returns had been strong, that her clients were people who understood that the big Toronto market had become impossible for anyone not already in it, and that there was real opportunity for people who moved early into markets like mine. I passed the rolls and didn't say anything. My son had been quiet for a few minutes. He was looking at his plate. He reached across the table, ostensibly to refill my water glass, and as he set it back down, his hand found mine on the armrest for just a second. 2 squeezes. I kept my face still. When he was small, 8, 9 years old, we'd had a code. His mother's idea, originally. She'd read something about family safety signals, the kind of thing parents thought about in the 90s. If either of us was ever somewhere uncomfortable, somewhere we needed the other to know without saying it out loud, we'd find a way to make contact. 2 squeezes meant, I need to talk to you, alone, soon. He'd used it maybe 3 times in his whole childhood. Once at a birthday party where a kid had been bullying him and he didn't want to say so in front of the other parents. Once when a teacher had said something that upset him and he didn't want to cry in the parking lot. Once when his mother got her first diagnosis and we were all pretending everything was fine and he wasn't pretending as well as the rest of us. I hadn't felt those 2 squeezes in 20 years. We finished dinner. I cleared the plates. Ingrid offered to help and I said no, it was fine, and my son said he'd give me a hand, and she said she'd take the dog out back for a few minutes since he'd been eyeing the door. As soon as she was outside, my son turned to me at the sink. He said, I'm sorry. I didn't know how to say this before we came. I turned off the tap. He told me that, about 3 weeks earlier, Ingrid had mentioned that she'd been speaking with a financial advisor, someone in her investment group, who was interested in connecting with people sitting on unencumbered real estate in secondary Ontario markets. People who own their homes outright and were open to conversations about leveraging that equity into managed portfolios. She'd mentioned without being specific that she had a family connection who might fit that profile. She'd been talking about me. My son hadn't pushed back right away. He said he'd felt something wrong with it, but hadn't trusted his instinct, had told himself he was being overprotective, that Ingrid was just enthusiastic about her work. But then a week later she'd asked him directly whether I had a financial advisor, whether I had a will, whether I'd ever considered a reverse mortgage. She framed it as concern, said she'd seen a lot of older people in situations where they were asset-rich and cash-poor and didn't have anyone helping them think it through. He said that's when he knew. I dried my hands on the dish towel. I asked him how long he'd been sitting with this. He said since Thursday. He'd been trying to figure out how to bring it up without blowing up the relationship, without making it into something bigger than it was, without being wrong about her. He said he'd almost convinced himself twice that he was misreading it. I told him he wasn't misreading it. I told him to go back in the living room and act normal, that Ingrid would be back in a minute and that I'd handle it. He looked at me the way he used to look at me when he was a kid, and I told him I'd handle something. A little relieved, a little worried, not entirely sure what handle it meant. I knew what it meant. I'd been working in financial compliance for 31 years, the last 14 of those as an independent compliance consultant, mostly for credit unions and smaller regional institutions. I knew what high-pressure investment pitches looked like. I knew what the language of legitimate opportunity sounded like versus the language of predatory solicitation dressed up to look the same. And I knew what due diligence looked like too. That night, after my son and Ingrid left, the goodbye at the door perfectly normal, Ingrid hugging me and saying she'd love dinner, I sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop. I started with her name and the name of the investment group she'd mentioned. I couldn't find a registered firm by that name anywhere in Ontario Securities databases. I checked the Ontario Securities Commission's investor registry. Nothing. I checked the national registration search through the Canadian Securities Administrators. Nothing there either. That doesn't always mean fraud. Small private equity operations sometimes structure themselves to avoid certain registration requirements, but it's a flag. I wrote down everything she'd said at dinner, the specific phrases: secondary markets, unencumbered real estate, managed portfolios, leveraging equity. Those phrases are used by legitimate advisors and by people who have learned to sound like them. The difference is usually in the paperwork, what they can produce, what they're registered to sell, who's backing them. The following week, I called a contact of mine at a regional credit union, a woman who'd been working in fraud prevention for 15 years. I gave her the name without explaining why I was asking. She called me back the next day. She said the name had come across her desk before, not in a formal complaint, but as a related party in a civil dispute 2 years earlier. A family in Sudbury who'd lost a significant amount of retirement savings in what their lawyer had described as an unregistered investment scheme targeting older homeowners in non-urban markets. She sent me the filing. The investment group had operated under a slightly different name. The woman described in the Sudbury case, mid-30s, confident, always introduced through a personal connection, matched the description I hadn't asked her to match. I sat with that for 2 days. I want to be honest, part of me didn't want it to be true. Not for my sake, for my son's. He'd been happy, happier than he'd been since his mother died, or at least happier than he'd let me see. Whatever Ingrid was or wasn't, she'd made him feel something, and I knew that what I was about to tell him was going to cost him that, and there is no version of that conversation that doesn't hurt. I called him on a Wednesday evening. I didn't tell him everything over the phone. I told him I'd found some things he needed to see and that I'd like him to come up on the weekend and that it would be better if he came alone. He was quiet on the line for a moment. Then he said, "You found something." It wasn't a question. I said yes. He came up that Saturday. He sat at the same table where we'd had dinner 2 weeks earlier. I laid out what I'd found. The registration search results, printed and annotated, the CSA database, the contact at the credit union, the full filing from Sudbury. I walked him through it the way I would have walked a client through it, methodically, without editorializing, just the information in the order it mattered. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he asked how certain I was. I told him I wasn't holding a conviction, and I wasn't. What I had was a pattern that fit a known type of scheme, an unregistered operation, a connection to a prior civil complaint, and a series of behaviors directed specifically at me as a target profile. I told him any one of those things alone might be explainable. All of them together was a different conversation. He asked what I thought he should do. I told him that was his decision, and I meant it. He was 31 years old. I could give him what I'd found. I couldn't make it mean something for him that only he could decide. He left that afternoon and I didn't hear from him for 4 days. On the 5th day he called. He told me he'd confronted Ingrid. He hadn't gone in hostile. He'd asked her directly about the investment group, about the registration, about the Sudbury connection. He said she'd had explanations for everything, ready and smooth, and that for about 20 minutes he'd almost believed her. He said what stopped him was something she'd said that she had no way of knowing unless she'd researched me specifically. She'd mentioned the approximate value of the house, not as a guess, as a number. He hadn't told her what the house was worth. He hadn't told her I owned it outright. He hadn't told her I'd worked in financial compliance. She'd done her homework on me before she'd ever met him. He ended the relationship that evening. I won't say it was easy after that. It wasn't. He went quiet for a while, not angry at me, but processing something that I think was harder than he wanted to admit. When you realize someone was performing a version of themselves, you don't just lose the relationship. You go back through every memory and wonder which parts were real. That's an exhausting kind of grief. It's quiet, and it doesn't look like grief from the outside, and there isn't a casserole-bringing tradition for it. I drove down to Toronto 3 weeks later. We didn't talk about Ingrid. We went to a hardware store because he'd been putting off replacing some fixtures in his bathroom. We had lunch at a diner he liked near his apartment, one of those old places on Bloor that still has laminated menus and a radio on behind the counter. At some point over coffee, he said, "How did you know when I signaled you at dinner?" I told him I didn't know. I knew something was wrong. That was all. The two squeezes told me he thought so too, and that was enough to make me pay attention. He looked at his coffee cup for a second. Then he said he hadn't even consciously decided to do it. He said his hand just found mine, and he'd done it the same way you'd reach for a railing in the dark. Not thinking. Just I filed a voluntary tip with the Ontario Securities Commission the following month. I included the documentation I'd gathered, the civil filing reference from Sudbury, the name of the investment group. Whether anything came of it, I don't know with certainty. My credit union contact called me 6 weeks later and said there were rumblings of a broader inquiry. That my tip wasn't the only one they'd received about the same operation. She didn't give me details, and I didn't ask for them. What I know is this. My son is careful now in ways he wasn't before, which I think is the right kind of careful, the kind that doesn't make you small but makes you slower to hand the benefit of the doubt to people who are counting on you to hand it quickly. He calls on Sundays still. Sometimes he drives up. Last spring he told me about a woman he'd started seeing, someone he'd known for a few years through work, not a new introduction. He said they'd been taking it slow. He sounded like himself when he said it, not like someone performing contentment. Just someone quietly telling his father something good. We didn't make it into a moment. That's not really how we operate. He told me. I said I was glad. We talked about something else, but I thought about it later, sitting in the kitchen with the dog at my feet and the furnace clicking on for the first time that season. I thought about how the signal had survived 20 years without us ever tending to it. How it had waited there unused until the night it was needed, and how my son's hand had found mine without him deciding to reach. Some things you build when your kids are small and you hope you'll never need them. Then one day in October you're passing the dinner rolls and you feel two squeezes and you understand that the thing you built was working all along.